Deep in the rain-soaked Oregon forest, a Navy SEAL on leave witnessed something no human should ever see. Under the cover of the storm, three Hells Angels were burying a woman alive, convinced the woods would keep their secret. They were wrong, because from the shadows, a Navy SEAL and his loyal German Shepherd were watching. In that moment, he made a choice. He wasn't going to walk away. He wasn't going to call it in. He was going to stop an execution. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more stories of courage, faith, and quiet justice. The rain did not fall in the Oregon pine forest. It descended, heavy and relentless, as if the sky itself were trying to erase something before dawn. Jack Carter moved through the trees with the unhurried precision of a man who had learned long ago that silence was not the absence of sound, but the discipline of listening. He was 38, tall at just over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders but lean everywhere else, built not for display but for endurance. His dark hair was cut short out of habit rather than regulation now, damp curls clinging stubbornly to his temples. A rough shadow of stubble framed a jawline sharpened by years of clenched decisions. Jack's eyes, steel gray and observant, rarely stopped moving, not because he was afraid, but because stillness had once cost lives. Mandatory leave had sent him here, back to the Oregon wilderness he knew as a boy, long before deserts and gunfire rewired his instincts. Officially, he was resting. In truth, he was hiding, from the echoes of orders shouted over comms, from the faces that visited him at night when the world went quiet. The forest was supposed to help. Rain, mud, cold, these were honest things. They didn't lie. Beside him moved Rex. The German Shepherd was nearly 9 years old now, his muzzle dusted faintly with gray, his coat a dense mix of sable and black that drank in the rain. Rex was large even for his breed, thick through the chest, powerful in the hindquarters, with amber-brown eyes that seemed to evaluate the world rather than simply observe it. He was a retired military working dog, trained once to detect explosives, track human scent, and ignore fear. What set Rex apart was not obedience, but judgment. He did not react blindly, he decided. Jack trusted Rex more than he trusted maps, radios, or his own instincts on their worst days. The dog padded forward without a leash, paws placing themselves where sound died into moss and soaked needles. No flashlight cut the dark. The forest didn't need to be seen, it needed to be felt. They had made camp earlier near a low ridge, a modest fire reduced now to embers. Jack had been cleaning his knife, a habit so ingrained it bordered on ritual, when Rex stopped. The dog's ears rotated forward, body stiffening into a posture Jack had not seen in months. Not alert, not alarmed, focused. Rex did not bark, he did not growl. He simply stood, weight shifting subtly onto his front legs, as if gravity itself had called him forward. Jack froze. His hand tightened once around the knife handle, then relaxed. Years ago, in another forest on another continent, ignoring a dog's hesitation had ended badly. He had learned. "What is it, buddy?" Jack murmured, voice barely louder than the rain. Rex's chest vibrated with a low, controlled rumble, not meant to warn, but to communicate urgency. He turned his head east, toward a section of forest that should have been empty, untouched, sacred in its indifference to human affairs. Jack stood, slipping into his rain shell, muscles responding before thought. Together they moved uphill, Jack stepping where Rex stepped, the pair advancing like shadows stitched into the storm. As they crested the ridge, the darkness fractured. Headlights, harsh, artificial, and completely wrong. White beams cut through rain and branches, illuminating a clearing that Jack knew was sometimes used by illegal dumpers or reckless locals. Tonight, it held something worse. A motorcycle idled nearby, its chrome dulled by mud, its engine ticking impatiently. 3 men stood in the glare, their silhouettes jagged and aggressive, leather jackets stretched tight across broad backs. They were members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Jack recognized the patch instantly, the winged skull familiar from too many briefing rooms and crime reports. These were not weekend riders. Their stance told the story. Feet planted wide, shoulders squared, bodies accustomed to violence as conversation. One of them, tall, thick-necked, with a beard braided tight against his chin, held a shovel and worked the earth with methodical force. Another, shorter but stockier, tattoos crawling up his arms like dark vines, wiped rain from his shaved head and laughed at something Jack couldn't hear. The third man stood apart, smoking beneath the rain with careless defiance, his posture relaxed in the way of someone used to being obeyed. Then Jack saw the hole, waist-deep already, fresh earth piled beside it, and near the edge of the pit lay a shape that was not debris. A woman. Even from a distance, Jack could tell she was alive. The body moved, just barely. She was slender, likely in her early 30s, with blonde hair plastered to her face by rain and blood. Her skin was pale beneath the mud, her clothing torn, her wrists bound behind her back. Tape covered her mouth, darkened by water and dirt. She trembled uncontrollably, not just from cold, but from the animal certainty of what was coming next. Rex's rumble deepened. His hackles rose, a dark ridge along his spine. Jack felt something inside him shift, settle, harden. This was not anger. Anger burned too fast. This was recognition, the kind that came when the world presented a line and dared you to step back. 3 men with shovels, 1 grave, 1 woman still breathing. Jack did not think about reporting it. He did not think about consequences, or leave papers, or explanations he might owe later. The forest had answered the question for him. He crouched behind the tree, rain soaking into his gloves, eyes locked on the clearing, heart slowing into that terrible calm he knew too well. He placed 2 fingers lightly against Rex's shoulder. Not yet. The wolves were close now, and the forest was watching. The 3 men wore the Hells Angels patch, the way lesser men wore uniforms. Not as decoration, but as a declaration that the rules bent around them. Leather jackets soaked dark with rain clung to their frames, creaking softly each time they moved, the sound oddly intimate in the open forest. The storm seemed to avoid them, as if even the weather had learned not to interfere. Duke Razor Malloy stood closest to the edge of the pit. He was in his mid-40s, tall and thick through the torso, with a chest that pushed forward naturally, the posture of a man who had never learned how to yield. His beard was dark and braided short at the chin, threaded with gray that spoke of years lived hard rather than long. A scar cut diagonally from his left ear to his jawline, pale and smooth, the souvenir of a bar fight decades earlier that had ended with Duke standing and someone else not. His eyes were a flat, washed-out blue, the kind that rarely blinked. Duke did not shout often. He didn't need to. His voice carried authority because it was always obeyed. Years ago, a younger Duke had learned that hesitation invited challenge, and challenge invited blood. He had never hesitated again. To Duke's right worked Troy Knuckles Benton, several inches shorter but built like a compressed spring. Troy's shaved head gleamed with rain, water running down over a face permanently twisted into a half-sneer. His forearms were a mess of tattoos, names crossed out, crude angels with broken wings, numbers that once meant loyalty to people now dead or vanished. His hands were enormous, knuckles swollen and misshapen from years of fights that started with words and ended with bone. Troy dug with violent efficiency, each thrust of the shovel punctuated by a grunt, as if the earth itself had personally offended him. He had grown up angry, learned early that fear came easier to others if you stayed loud and unpredictable. Violence, to Troy, was not cruelty. It was stress relief. A few steps back stood Evan Grim Hale. He was the quiet one, early 30s, leaner than the other 2, with a narrow face and deep-set eyes that reflected almost no light. His brown hair hung wet and straight across his forehead, giving him a boyish look that clashed with the deadness in his expression. Evan smoked without urgency, sheltering the cigarette with a steady hand, watching rather than participating. He had joined the club late, after a childhood that taught him silence was safer than protest. People mistook his quiet for restraint. They were wrong. Evan didn't speak because he didn't need to. When he acted, it was final. Between them lay Emily Parker. She was 32, slender, her frame more suited to long nights hunched over notebooks than surviving a forest grave. Her blonde hair, usually kept shoulder length and neat, was now tangled and streaked with mud, strands plastered to her cheeks and lips. The tape across her mouth had rubbed her skin raw, leaving angry red marks that stood out starkly against her pale complexion. Her eyes were hazel, wide and glassy with terror, darting between the men as if tracking predators circling wounded prey. Her clothes, once practical, earth-toned, chosen to blend in rather than stand out, were torn at the seams, soaked through, heavy with rain. Her wrists were bound tightly behind her back, with zip ties that bit into her skin, cutting circulation and leaving her fingers numb. Emily's body shook uncontrollably. The cold mattered, but not as much as the understanding settling into her bones. This was not a threat, not leverage, not a warning. This was an ending. Duke kicked a clod of wet earth into the pit, watching it slide down the side and disappear. "Pick it up," he said, his voice rough but calm. "Storm won't wait on your mood." He glanced down at Emily as if she were a broken tool left in the way. "You should have stopped digging where you were told." Emily tried to speak through the tape, a muffled sound tearing at her throat. Her eyes locked onto Duke's, searching not for mercy. She had already learned better, but for delay. Seconds mattered. Breath mattered. Troy laughed, a sharp bark that held no humor. "She's tougher than she looks," he said, jamming the shovel deeper. "Still breathing, gotta give her that." He leaned closer to Emily, rain dripping from his nose. Most people cry more by now. Evan exhaled smoke slowly. "Doesn't matter," he said, voice quiet and flat. "Ground's soft, holes deep enough." That was when Emily understood the most terrifying part. None of them were excited. None of them were nervous. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a chore, scheduled and executed with the same detached focus as changing oil or fixing a tire. She wasn't special. She was inconvenient. In her mind, images flashed. Her small apartment with mismatched furniture, her father's old camera sitting on the shelf, the half-finished article saved on a password-protected drive. She had known this investigation was dangerous. She had told herself danger was part of the job, but knowing and accepting were different things. Her chest tightened as the pit loomed closer, the smell of wet earth filling her nose. Duke stepped forward, boots sinking into mud, and crouched beside her. Up close, Emily could see the fine lines around his eyes, the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth that suggested impatience rather than cruelty. "Nothing personal," he said, almost conversational. "You just kept asking the wrong questions." He straightened and nodded to Troy. "Finish it." The shovel hit the ground again. Above them, unseen, rain continued to fall, washing footprints, blurring edges, doing its quiet work of erasure. Duke believed the forest would swallow the night whole, keep its secrets like it always had. He was wrong. Jack did not deliberate. The most important decisions of his life had never arrived with committees or second chances. They came like lightning, brief and irrevocable. He felt the weight of the moment settle, cool and exact, and placed 2 fingers against Rex's shoulder. No pressure, no urgency, only permission. That was enough. Rex launched downhill through the rain, a dark blur cutting across mud and roots with a speed that belonged to muscle memory rather than youth. At nearly 9 years old, he no longer moved like a reckless pup. His power came from economy, every stride chosen. His coat, thick and rain-slicked, flared as he closed the distance, amber eyes fixed on the man holding the shovel. Rex did not go for the throat. He had been trained otherwise, trained to disable without killing when control mattered. His jaws clamped onto Troy, knuckles bent in his forearm with bone-crushing precision. The shovel flew free, skidding across wet earth. Troy screamed, a raw sound torn from the belly, and stumbled backward as Rex's weight took him down. Jack was already moving. He broke cover at a sprint that erased the distance between observer and participant in seconds, boots biting into mud, shoulders low. Evan Grimm Hale turned too late. Jack's left hand struck Evan's jaw, snapping his head sideways, while his right hooked behind the knee in the same motion. Evan hit the ground hard, breath gone, rain filling his mouth as Jack rolled through and rose again without pause. Duke Razor Malloy reacted with instinct, honed by years of street violence. He swung the crowbar in a brutal arc, meant to end the fight before it began. Jack stepped inside the swing, close enough to smell tobacco and wet leather, trapped Duke's wrist against his own forearm, and twisted. There was a sharp pop, ligaments complaining, followed by Duke's grunt of surprise. Jack's knee drove into Duke's midsection, folding him forward, and a controlled strike to the side of the neck dropped him to the ground, stunned but conscious. The exchange took less time than a breath. There was no shouting, no speech. The rain continued to hammer the clearing, indifferent. Troy lay pinned beneath Rex, who held him with a low vibrating growl that promised consequences. Evan curled on his side, gasping, while Duke stared up at the sky, blinking rain from his eyes as if the night had betrayed him. Jack turned to Emily. Up close, she looked smaller than he had thought. Her shoulders narrow, her skin pale beneath streaks of mud and blood. Her hazel eyes were wide, locked on him with the frantic focus of someone who had learned not to trust sudden kindness. Jack cut the tape from her mouth first, careful not to tear skin already raw. then sliced through the zip ties binding her wrists. The plastic snapped, and Emily sucked in a breath that became a sob she couldn't stop. Her hands shook violently as circulation returned, fingers tingling with pain. "It's okay," Jack said quietly, not because words could fix anything, but because silence sometimes made fear louder. He shrugged out of his rain shell and wrapped it around her shoulders, cinching it tight to trap warmth. Emily swayed, knees buckling, and Jack scooped her up without comment, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. She was light, too light, the kind of weight loss that came from too many nights spent chasing answers instead of sleep. Behind them, Rex released Troy on Jack's whistle and repositioned himself immediately, standing between Jack and the fallen men. His ears stayed forward, body squared, tail still. He was bleeding slightly from the gums where Troy's jacket zipper had caught him. A thin line of red lost quickly in the rain, but his posture did not waver. "Stay down," Jack said to the three men, his voice low and steady, not raised, not threatening, simply final. He did not wait for acknowledgement. He turned and moved toward the tree line, Rex flanking him, matching pace. The forest swallowed them in seconds, branches closing like curtains after a play. Emily clutched Jack's jacket, her face buried against his shoulder, breath coming in sharp, uneven pulls. Her body shook with shock now that the immediate danger had passed, the delayed tax of terror demanding payment. Jack adjusted his grip, angling her head away from the rain, and felt the familiar switch inside himself, the one that turned combat into caretaking without pause. They climbed, the ascent steep and punishing, mud sucking at Jack's boots, rain slicking rocks into hazards. Rex ranged ahead, stopping every few yards to listen, to scent the air. Jack trusted him to warn if pursuit followed. He did not believe the three men would give chase immediately. Pride and pain had a way of slowing reckless courage. Still, Jack moved fast. As they neared the ridge where he had camped earlier, Jack felt the weight of something else settle alongside relief. Responsibility. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Whatever came next would not be quiet. He accepted that without regret. He glanced down at Emily. Her eyes were closed now, lashes wet, her breathing shallow but steady. She was alive. That was enough for this moment. The forest around them whispered with rain and wind, old and watchful, as if acknowledging a debt paid in full. Jack did not look back. The cabin emerged from the trees like a memory that refused to die. It sat low against the slope, its rough-hewn logs darkened by decades of rain and sap, the roof sagging just enough to suggest age without surrender. Jack Carter slowed only when the door was within reach. He kicked it once to break the seal of damp wood and old rust, then stepped inside with Emily cradled against his chest. The air smelled of pine resin, dust, and the faint ghost of smoke. An honest smell, untouched by engines or fear. Jack set her down gently on the narrow iron-framed bed in the corner, its mattress thin but dry beneath a folded canvas tarp. He moved with efficient calm, the kind that came from years of triage under worse conditions. He stripped away wet layers, dried her skin with a clean bandana, and wrapped her in wool blankets pulled from a cedar chest at the foot of the bed. His hands were large and steady, scarred across the knuckles, the fingers of a man who had learned to be precise when imprecision meant death. He checked her ribs with careful pressure, counting breaths, noting the shallow hitch on the left side. Bruised, possibly cracked, but not punctured, not yet. Rex took position by the door without instruction, his broad body settling into a sphinx-like posture across the threshold. The dog's coat steamed faintly as heat returned to his muscles. His ears pivoted at every sound the storm carried down the slope. 9 years old, past his prime by military standards, Rex still held the posture of duty as if it were a birthright. Jack fed dry kindling into the stone hearth and coaxed a flame from stubborn embers. Light spread across the cabin, revealing shelves lined with rusted tools, old coffee tins, and a chipped enamel mug. The glow softened the sharp edges of the night, and, slowly, Emily's shivering eased. She woke with a gasp, eyes flying open, hands clawing for purchase. Panic surged through her like a second pulse. The ceiling was wrong, the air smelled of smoke. A man stood too close. She scrambled backward until the iron headboard stopped her, breath ragged, throat burning. "Easy," Jack said, keeping his voice low and his hands visible, stepping back to give her space. He was tall and broad, his silhouette imposing even softened by firelight, but his posture changed deliberately. Shoulders angled away, stance open. Years ago, a single moment of hesitation had cost him a teammate in a city far from here. Since then, he had learned to make his intentions unmistakable. Emily's gaze flicked past him and landed on Rex. The dog did not advance. He merely lifted his head and rested his chin on the edge of the bed, eyes warm and steady, breath slow. It was a small thing, that gesture, but it cut through her terror more effectively than words. Her hands loosened their grip on the blanket. Tears came without warning, hot and relentless, and she pressed her palms to her face as if to hold herself together. "My name is Emily Parker," she said when she could breathe again, voice hoarse. She was in her early 30s, slender to the point of fragility, her blonde hair now hanging in damp strands around a face marked by exhaustion rather than age. There was a stubbornness in her eyes, though, a refusal to disappear. "I'm an investigative reporter, Portland-based, freelance lately." She swallowed. "I followed a supply chain tied to the Hells Angels. I got too close." Jack listened without interrupting, kneeling to check the dressing on her wrists where the zip ties had cut in. He cleaned a shallow abrasion with antiseptic from his kit. The sting made her flinch, but she didn't pull away. "They took my phone," Emily continued. "My camera. Everything, but not the card." She hesitated, then nodded toward the boots drying near the hearth. "It's in the heel, micro SD. I hollowed it out months ago after a source told me arrogance is the best hiding place." Jack retrieved the boot and pried up the worn inner sole. The card emerged sealed in plastic, small enough to vanish in a pocket, heavy enough to alter lives. He held it between thumb and forefinger, feeling its weight settle into a decision he had already made. Rex rose and crossed the room, sniffing Emily once, then sitting at her side. The dog was calm, his presence anchoring the space. Jack noticed a thin line of blood along Rex's gum and cleaned it quickly, murmuring praise in a low tone that made the dog's tail thump once against the floor. Emily watched the exchange, something easing in her chest. "They weren't improvising," she said quietly. "They've done it before." Jack met her eyes. He believed her. The cabin creaked as wind pressed against it, but the door held. He tucked the card into a pocket inside his jacket, close to his heart. "Then we don't waste time," he said. "We rest enough to move. After that, we choose ground they don't expect." Outside, the rain softened. Inside, the fire burned steady. For the first time since the clearing, Emily felt the shape of tomorrow return. Fragile, uncertain, but present. Jack stood watch while she slept, Rex at his feet, the cabin holding their secrets as it always had. Engines returned before dawn, their roar climbing the slopes like an approaching storm. Headlights carved white scars through the trees, sweeping trunks and undergrowth with impatient hunger. Jack Carter felt it in his chest before he heard it fully, the certainty that the Hells Angels would not accept loss quietly. Running, he knew, would stretch fear thin, but never break it. Ending it required sound, light, and witnesses. Jack moved first, not with panic, but with intent. He built the lie carefully, a trail that spoke loudly enough to be believed. He dragged branches across wet ground to exaggerate footprints, snapped saplings at deliberate angles, and cracked a flare just long enough to stain the fog with smoke before smothering it. He tossed an empty fuel can downhill, letting it clatter and roll until it disappeared into brush. The forest learned the story he wanted told. When the bikers surged after it, engines snarling and men shouting, Jack slipped away in the opposite direction, heart steady, breath measured. Emily Parker and Rex moved together along the ridge, the path narrow and slick. Emily's stride was uneven, her ribs still tender, but she pushed through, jaw set, hair tied back with a strip torn from her shirt. She was pale under the grime, freckles faint against her cheeks, eyes bright with a resolve that had replaced fear. The old broadcast tower rose ahead like a skeleton against the gray steel legs webbed with rust, ladders groaning softly in the wind. It had been decommissioned years ago, forgotten by budgets and pride, but its bones were sound. Rex went first, climbing with the patient power of experience, nails finding purchase where metal thinned. He was slower now, age tugging at his joints, but purpose kept him sure. Emily followed, palms burning, breath controlled. Inside the control room, dust-coated consoles and dead insects lined the corners. A single emergency unit blinked red, stubborn as a heartbeat. Emily slid the micro SD from its sleeve, hands steady despite the cold, and slotted it into the reader. She knew systems, had learned them the hard way, after sources vanished and doors closed. She routed the feed to emergency override, bypassed filters with codes that municipalities forgot to change, and checked levels twice. When she pressed transmit, the room hummed as if remembering itself. Voices burst across the valley, numbers, names, times, orders spoken with the casual certainty of men who believed they would never be heard. The town woke to its own truth. Radios crackled in kitchens and trucks, at gas stations, and on nightstands. People paused mid-motion, hands hovering, faces turning toward the sound, as if it were a summons. The spell broke not with a shout, but with recognition. Below, Jack drew the hunters where he wanted them. Open ground, bad angles. Duke Razor Malloy charged first, rage loosening his discipline. He looked smaller without control, beard dripping rain, eyes wild as he closed the distance. Jack held until the last second, then stepped aside, letting momentum betray the man. Duke stumbled, recovered, raised his arm, and Rex was there, a blur from the flank, jaws closing not on flesh, but on the weapon hand. The move was clean, practiced, merciful in its precision. Duke screamed as pain taught him a lesson he had long avoided. Power is not ownership. Sirens answered the broadcast, not as distant rumors, but as converging lines of sound. Other engines slowed, hesitated, turned back. Men argued, then fell silent as the radio kept speaking. Proof piling on proof, unanswerable. The wolves scattered when they understood the forest had changed. Sunlight reached the ridge as Emily cut transmission. She leaned against the console, chest heaving, tears mixing with a tired smile. Rex sat at her feet, tail thumping once, satisfied. Jack climbed to them minutes later, rain-soaked and calm, the fight already behind him. He checked Rex's mouth, Emily's breathing, and the horizon. Nothing chased them now. They left as quietly as they had arrived. No speeches, no cameras. The town would tell the story itself, in kitchens and storefronts, in the way people stood a little straighter the next day. At the edge of the trees, Emily paused and looked back at the tower, then at Jack. "Thank you," she said, not loudly, but with weight. Jack nodded. Words would only thin it. They walked out together as the morning warmed the earth, carrying a simple truth the forest had taught them, with rain and mud. Evil lasts not because it is strong, but because silence feeds it. Break the silence, and even wolves learn to run. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as thunder or blinding light. Sometimes they come as a man who refuses to look away, a woman who dares to tell the truth, and a dog who chooses to stand between evil and the innocent. In this story, the miracle was not that violence was stopped, but that God's light found a voice. When fear tried to bury truth in silence, courage spoke. When darkness relied on secrecy, the truth traveled farther than any engine, louder than any threat. Scripture reminds us, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And so it did here, not through power, but through obedience to what is right. In our everyday lives, the forest looks different. It may be an office where injustice goes unchallenged, a family where pain is hidden, a neighbor who suffers quietly, or a moment when staying silent feels easier than standing firm. The lesson is simple, yet demanding. God often works through ordinary people who choose not to turn away. You do not need to be fearless, you only need to be faithful. If this story touched your heart, let it move beyond the screen. Share it with someone who feels alone in the dark. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice matters more than you know. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories that remind us hope is still alive. And may God bless you and your family. May He protect you in your coming and your going. May He give you the courage to speak when silence is tempting, and the compassion to act when others hesitate. May His light guide you, just as it broke through the storm in this story. If you believe that God is our refuge and strength, type Amen in the comments, and let us stand together in faith.